to sort of set the stage for the panel. I guess we have about 45 minutes, and we have some common set of themes that we'll go off with, and then get the panelists to comment, and towards the middle of the theme or towards the end of the theme, you can ask questions. But if you can't resist it and you want to ask a question, ask regardless. So the idea here is to keep it, very interactive, and there are as many panelists here as there are attendees. So let's just have like a.
I thought the idea was like let the conversation flow.
Yeah, and I'll just try to stay out of the way. So, should we start? Why don't we introduce ourselves down here? What do you name? What do you do? And where you are?
My name's Dowdle. I'm at Task. Do I have to shout into this? Okay. Is that better? I'm with Task. I direct the engineering efforts at Task for a project management software company as a service.
I'm Doubrovkine, you can call me DB. I run engineering in a New York startup called art.sy.
I'm Yoav, I'm the CDO of JFrog, mainly running the future development of our products.
I'm Saleem Siddiqui. I'm a developer and agile coach with ThoughtWorks, and I'm from Chicago.
I'm Noah Sussman. I'm the test architect at Etsy here in New York.
I think I'm going to do this if I can. Yeah. So, and then I'm Kohsuke, and I write Jenkins.
I'm Harpreet, and I occasionally tell him to write something in Jenkins. Work at Cloudways and in product management. So the first question I had was ask this panel, what are sort of the industry trends that you're watching out for?
Well, like I said in my talk, I've been really deeply involved with scaling out a Jenkins cluster for the last 2 years. So I'm first of all just sort of interested in what the community's been building lately in terms of scalability. I saw somebody talking a little earlier about looking for a plugin that will let you visualize a lot of sort of hierarchical builds. That's something I'm certainly interested in. Right?
So when you say scaling, it's not like a performance or the size of the instance, but more like more complex things that's going on inside Jenkins?
Yeah, I think we have a really good ops team, I think, so maybe I'm a little different than a lot of people, and that scaling hardware, scaling concurrency is not, it's been challenging, but the real challenge has been scaling the sort of communication properties of Jenkins. We're getting to a point where we have so many jobs and they're all run concurrently and they're all sort of mission critical that despite the fact that we've written our own plugin and we have a lot of custom monitoring, I still feel like it could be better. So I'm interested in what people are doing in that regard.
He got the very interesting things going in his stuff that he got this different views to it.
Yeah, and when it comes to industry trends, it's an interesting thing to ask about it at a Jenkins conference, because of all the conferences that I've been to this year, I think this is my 4th or 5th where I've talked about what we're doing with Jenkins. The kind of things that Jenkins excels at, it's accessibility through APIs, it's interoperability, and it's the deep automation emphasis. These are things that are novel to a lot of people in the software industry still. And I think deep automation is something we're just starting to understand with the emergence of cloud computing. And so, over time, Jenkins is really well positioned to take a central role in that growth. And it definitely, as I talk to project managers at more traditional waterfall type development houses and to executives in more stable businesses where startup and web software is not their core competency, they see this stuff and it's like magic to them. So it's going to be neat as Jenkins grows and starts to permeate those industries more completely. I think it's got a lot of headroom.
So one question I was asked in Paris was, with all this Jenkins kind of getting more central to the automation part, is it the next Puppet or /Chef? And I was kind of interested in seeing what you think about it.
I can give some notes on that. I think being in a startup, we are kind of the far end of automation, where we have automated everything, including some of ourselves. And we are definitely in the DevOps mode with no QA and no developer, no operations. We do everything from scratch, and Jenkins plays that automation role, doing all the mechanical tasks that we can possibly imagine, whether it's production automation, overnight cron jobs, builds, etc. So yeah, it's becoming the central orchestrator of everything we do.
Yeah.
About the industry trends, one of the things that we have observed, our clients are asking us actually, is taking automation all the way across the entire code base. So databases traditionally have been database scripts, and both from a schema perspective and data population perspective, usually been left out of the loop when it comes to CI. Obviously, Rails has changed the picture a lot in the last several years, and probably that's the paradigm that's catching on. So a lot of our clients are certainly asking us from an industry trend perspective, what can they do? And it's certainly not something that a particular CI tool would either recommend or not. CI tools are not to it. They can build whatever you tell them to build. But certainly from an industry perspective, it's the code versus the database script divide that we see people are now wanting to bridge, which is heartening to note. And obviously, this move towards CD deployment is certainly energized people, and they want to, at least they've read the book, they've read Justin Farley's book, or at least have bought it and it's on their shelf. And certainly they're interested in how they can move towards the model that you are at. So that's, and the DevOps movement obviously is something we espouse, so we're heartened to see that our clients also do that. About the chef and puppet thing, Harpreet, I just got an email before I was walking up to the podium, and people were saying that they hope that Jenkins doesn't become a chef or a puppet, because SRP single responsibility principles that apply to products as well. Obviously, the code we write, try to write SRP. But they were saying a lot of my people who I commune with, Jenkins fans, were saying that they were really hoping that it doesn't actually become that. Obviously, integration points are a different thing. But having its core strength as a CI of a lot of plugins is probably where it shines a lot. Taking over the role that chef and puppet play in desktop management is probably a little bit outside of the sharp focus that it has.
I do, however, wonder what kind of things we can do better when we integrate with Chef or Puppet. I agree that I don't think there's much point, or I don't think we have enough manpower to try to take over that, or any point in doing that. But I do think there must be something better we can do when you're using both at the same time. I only do a part-time Chef recipe writer, and I suck at that, so I can't really see where I could provide more value at. But that's, if anyone is using it, I'd like to get the sense of what can be done better, when you drive Chef or Puppet from Jenkins.
I think the key scenario could be around parallelism and free nodes. One thing that I'd like is automatic scaling of slaves, and those are deployed with Chef or Puppet, and some integration where Jenkins grows bigger and can get smaller with those tools at runtime, depending on the load or the number of jobs running, could be very interesting.
So you can already run, there's this slave setup plugin that allows you to run a script upon the slave connection. So I originally named it the Puppet plugin so that you can do pseudo Puppet and then run the modules. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess problem solved.
So for us, we have both a cloud version, but we also suffer from having a standalone product. And in terms of complexity, and that's something we just started out experiment with a couple of months ago, is to take all the stacks that you have to support and having Jenkins run Vagrant and fire up all those stacks and running all the tests on all the different stacks that we are trying to sort of certify. So that became really, really tough when you have so many moving parts in your product. That's another trend. And especially with cloud, when you're developing a cloud software and on our cloud software, we also have many moving parts. So to use Jenkins to test those different parts.
One thing I wanted to add, we run into that same issue because we use Vagrant, are beginning to use Vagrant for multiple things, one being our developer VMs, and we have a very complex system. One trend that I see this sort of space going, continuous deployment is sort of like the new Git, and I think there's a space for a company like GitHub to introduce it, because until GitHub kind of came around, people were like, Git is complex, and they didn't see the value, and the cloud. Deploying to the cloud is something that is much harder to do after your application is already written, rather than starting from scratch. So I think maybe having a stack where you're you're continuously deploying from the beginning would be much easier to set up than taking an application, moving it forward, like moving it to deployment, because it's so complex.
I mean, your comment almost feels like I set you up to pitch CloudBees, but we do some of that today, so I'm not going to get into the CloudBees part of things, but I think the last part was around the cloud. So I wanted to get a sense of how many people use the cloud or fairly close to using any part of the cloud, be it a IaaS or a PaaS, or are considering connecting to their Jenkins instances into the cloud. 2, 3. Well, you're an extreme use case, so you're out. So for the others, what's sort of preventing you from getting there? Anybody?
So I work at a larger company that's got a lot of compliance regulation thing. So using Amazon EC2 is just not the thing. So yeah, until private clouds pick up, I know they're working on it, but who knows how long that's out. So that's the main.
The compliance is the main.
Yeah, like we can't have our data outside the company by the wall.
Every business has a different level of risk that they're willing to tolerate, and sometimes when you're in startup mode, or if you're an open source project, you put everything out there, right? Everything except passwords, I think somebody said. Sometimes even those on accident. And then you can go all the way to the other side, right, where you have something like Sarbanes-Oxley or government regulation that even prevents you from doing things in a continuous deployment kind of manner. I can tell you that in almost all cases, there's something valuable in the cloud that you can get. Like our particular example, when we first started talking about cloud at AppTask, involved conversations with the people that have those opinions, right? And we had operations folks that were extremely nervous about moving things that we've been doing locally up into the cloud for the first time. And so we had hard choices to make. An example is we decided we would never ever put our source code in the cloud. No virtual private cloud, no tunnel. We just wouldn't do it. And so that was an interesting challenge. But what we ended up with was compiling all of our data, so it's just like an installer, and then just sending an installer up into the cloud. So there's never any intellectual property that's actually at risk with the cloud, even though we're using hundreds and hundreds of machines, and we keep everything that's sensitive on our own local network, and there's no ability for, aside from Jenkins slaves themselves, I guess, for anything out in Amazon EC2 to come back into our network. So it can be accomplished. I think most of the fear around the cloud is fear of the unknown. And once operations teams get their heads around what's actually involved, for the most part, it's relatively benign from a security perspective.
You don't think that production data, and in continuous deployment, the important thing is to have your production mimic your test environments, mimic your development environments.
Right.
So if you're going to go out to the cloud to do testing and staging and then back inside to the production with different tools?
Another great example. So production environment from an infrastructure perspective, yeah, going to be the same, right? We use the same vendors for database, same versions, all that stuff. From a customer data perspective, I think Joel actually wrote a script that does this. We run an anonymizer over all of it. So it's the exact same object graph. You know, the relationships in the database are all the same, but all the names are scrubbed and all different objects have all data scrubbed out of them. So if you're running a debugger against it, it behaves exactly as it would in production. But there's no way that a human being would ever be able to grok what data is actually out there. So again, that came out of a conversation with operations where they had a concern about production data in the cloud, and we were able to come to an agreement about what would be an acceptable way to accomplish both of our goals.
So for us, the problem with running everything in the cloud was just reliability because of the extremely narrow deploy window. It's interesting to listen to not necessarily people here, but some of the other talks I've been to on continuous deploy. People will talk about sort of their mitigation, sometimes automated mitigation tools for like, oh, if an instance goes away, it's no big deal, we know, and we rebuild, it doesn't affect the build. And it's like, for me, it's like if an instance goes away, that's like another couple of minutes to find another instance or restart the test, and like I have a 10-minute window for the QA build. So that was, at least 2 years ago, that was initially why we brought a lot of things in-house. But on the other hand, I mean, we run a lot of our Selenium tests on EC2 just because the unlimited instances is really useful there. And a lot of our Selenium tests run as sort of production monitoring tools rather than blocking a build. So there it's kind of, there's less of a time, it's less time sensitive. It takes, it sometimes takes 10 minutes to get feedback instead of like 4 minutes, like that's cool. And I think that sounds really cool, what Jesse was talking about in terms of being able to scrub all the data. That's not something that we've been able to implement yet, that we certainly talked about it. What we wound up doing for our production Selenium tests, though, is we worked it out with security to where they only do what a user would do. There's nothing, they don't have any knowledge of the database, they don't have access to anything that a normal user wouldn't have access to outside the firewall. They use, they either create accounts or they use pre-existing accounts, but those accounts are not special. They don't even have the admin flag that people who work at Etsy have. They're just like vanilla user accounts. And there's a lot of value there. Certainly for validating critical path. I mean, that's what we want to know in production. It's like, can just a regular vanilla user navigate the critical path. So they work really well for that. It was interesting as sort of somebody who was sort of used to like longer QA cycles, and the team that I hired were all sort of people who come from more traditional QA backgrounds. So it took us a while to get our heads around the idea that like this is still useful even though you can't tear down fixtures and you can't make SQL queries and there's no special visibility. And it's sort of a subset of what we'd be able to do with those tools, but it is actually really, really helpful.
So from a startup point of view, you may tend to trust the cloud providers more than you should. This was our experience in the beginning. So we say those guys are big, they have really, really big customers, they know what they're doing. Things are probably going to be much more reliable than storing stuff in-house. But our experience was just the opposite. So we had, so I won't say who was our cloud provider, but the biggest. And in our experience, things break a lot. And the first thing we had to do when moving to cloud, and that was kind of unexpected from us, and it's behind us now, is to implement fast recovery procedures and really fast backup procedures and worry about collocation and, I don't know how to say, decollocation of our backups. So for recovery and for redundancy and so on. So just be well.
They always claim that the service is up and running, but
I prefer the cloud providers that fail a lot because this forces us to build more robust systems.
It almost seems like Lord Voldemort, he shall not be named here. Right. So, well, shifting topics then. So, what's exciting in the new upcoming features in Jenkins? You guys tracking some of those?
Let's see. You mean what?
What are the exciting features coming in Jenkins, or you want people to know about?
You mean what people want to see in the future version in Jenkins?
What's being built right now?
Because that doesn't sound too much like a panel discussion. I guess that's my problem. But I don't know what's being worked on. So I guess I've already talked a bit about what I wanted to work on this morning. Right? It's like parallelizations, especially with cloud.
Closer.
Yeah, especially with cloud, because I think there's economic incentive to run more things in parallel. So I want to help people do that. So that's one. The choreography stuff, UI improvement, and so on. So I guess to turn around the table, I'm curious, like, do any of those features make sense, or should I be spending time on other things? If so, then what are those? Yes.
Jenkins Enterprise Cloud Beast Ever Cloud.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, of
Jenkins.
course.
I feel torn about UI improvements.
Yeah.
On one side, I think it would be amazing to get a much better Jenkins in terms of user experience. On the other hand, what really matters is the functional aspects of it. And it does what it does, and it does it really well. So spending a lot of time on UX design might make a sexy UI, but is it actually going to make the product that much better? I give it a 50-50. I'm curious to hear what other panels have to say.
So the interesting thing is that it's not that I have to do all the work, but when we identify some things that gets people excited, they tend to work on it. So this Twitter Bootstrap UI, I haven't spent any time at all. I'm just encouraging the guys doing it. That's awesome. And then they just keep on doing it.
Twitter Bootstrap is not going to make the UI much better.
Okay, well anyway.
Make it more generic.
Right, so the idea being that like if those things are making sense, we can normally bring in people interested in working on to do it. But yeah, but I see your point. It's not exactly a feature.
So from my point of view, a big +1 on the UI, especially if you have complex configuration, you need to ident stuff.
A couple comments. In our talk earlier today, we talked about vendor selection and that we settled on Jenkins. We weighed the pros and cons of TeamCity, Jenkins, we looked at Go, and I can tell you that the biggest red mark on Jenkins and across the whole organization was the UI.
Okay.
In fact, it almost derailed our adoption of Jenkins. We had a couple of key people who were they said, we hate this thing. It's ugly. Just being totally candid with you. And I'm really happy functionality won out, and I think we showed in our demo, we had one of our UX guys jumped on it, reskinned the whole thing just so he could even stand to look at his build in the morning because he's a creative guy and he just refuses to work with software he thinks is ugly. So what am I trying to say? My point is that you don't have to create a beautiful user experience as the open source community, but if you'll create some great extension points that allow for better configurability, that will help a ton. In the case of the test result page, we've hacked additional columns into there with HTML using the badge extension point. And just the fact that that's what we had to do in order to just add a column to the test results view shows that there's a great opportunity there to make it much more pluggable in the future.
Okay.
I think you do that right, you won't have to worry about people complaining about UX as much.
So yeah, I'd like to hear more about those concrete things, the extension points in the UI that we needed to add. That is, we always, when people tell us this is the thing that they want to present, it makes it a lot easier for us to code up. So I take that on the column on the test report.
So I'm curious, obviously, you mentioned Go. The one thing I like about Go, obviously, is the presence of build pipelines out of the box. Of course, you can set them up in Jenkins, you can promote artifacts and set them up that way. However, I'm curious as to where that effort is going to be, because I personally would like to see a lot more improvement in that realm.
Right. Yeah. So the build pipeline plugin is actually a pretty popular plugin that it gives you a decent view and all. And I was actually very inspired by what he was showing. So it brings in certain kind of extensibility aspect to it, like how you aggregate the column and so on. So I really wanted to see that open source out there so that we can tinker with it a little bit, and that might be quite interesting. So.
Yeah, I missed the Twitter Bootstrap UI thing, so I'm actually excited to hear about that, because I think just having a more modern architecture for the UI that's easier for people to work on would probably be really helpful. I reskinned our Jenkins recently. I'm old enough that I did work with Prototype when it was the only thing out there, and I did that. I wanted to do that. So I've got jQuery to work on top of Prototype, but it took some doing. But it was sort of even though it was just me on the project, it was kind of like, once I got jQuery to work, it was just sort of like, oh, awesome, now this is fun. Like I'm gonna like hack on this, and I lost. I was like, there went the weekend, and it was cool. Everybody was happy with what we came up with, but it was just making it a little bit, making it a little bit easier, making it a little bit more modern tool set. I think is helpful in itself. I'd also say, I think I've kind of a special situation in that there's 20 to 30 different people deploying code every day, sometimes more, and all of them sometimes need to look at CI, and so I have a lot of sort of non-experts looking at Jenkins. So for them, it's UI is really important because they don't have any context. For me, if it's there's places where maybe I prefer rounded corners or a different font, but it's I know it so well it doesn't really matter. But for somebody who's just sort of arrived there because a test broke, and this is the one time they're deploying today and the one time a test broke this week, it's just the more stuff I can hide from them, and the more pretty useful things I can put right in front of them, the happier they're going to be. I also think it's interesting to think about exposing endpoints, or just exposing more through the JSON API. I think we've talked quite a bit about just using the API to build our own UI. Not even necessarily because we don't like the Jenkins UI, but because our deploy process is so sort of specialized that it's for us the build pipeline view is hard to use because it doesn't. It's hard to represent our build process because you can have a deployment that starts and then stops, and then is abandoned, and then there's another deployment that starts and goes all the way through. And the build pipeline can sort of represent that, but not really. We've hacked it a little bit, and we're at a point now where we sort of stepped back and said maybe we really should just build our own thing, and we're starting to look at how we could do that with the API. So yeah, I think the idea of UI extension points is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Other requests from the audience?
It's really silly, but my project-based matrix is so long. I would love to have all the permissions that are at the top replicated further down.
Ah, okay, yeah, that's a
because
great
have to
feature.
count squares. See, okay, on this one I need to go over 4 squares. But yeah, and I know because I have so many people in my matrix, but that would help.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
There's plugins that can just take a table and take the headers of the table and let the headers of the table stick to the top of the screen.
Right.
That might be a nice solution rather than having to repeat or break it out.
Yeah, so send in a pull request, please. Problem solved.
Right. I think the whole new UI on top of the JSON API would definitely be a very modern approach. We built all of our UI like this, and in a weekend you can whip up a basic Jenkins UI with Backbone.js and a couple of other tools and have something that has a very different experience. So maybe decoupling the UI from the back end is a better investment in time, providing clear overview of all the APIs available.
So the challenge there is these plugins that what they bring in as data model doesn't make. I mean, no one else but those plugins know it. So having those two-way extensivity, I think, seems to be tricky to me. I don't know how you could.
The thing is, there is a very strong coupling between the type of plugins and where the configuration ends up on the screen. So, for example, the factory plugin, some parts are at the top of the screen, and then you have to look for the other parts in the bottom of the screen, just because they are different. Sometimes it makes sense, like build steps, you want them organized by their order, but sometimes you want your configuration to be consolidated at one place.
Sure.
Pluggable UIs exist, so the plugin would have to publish its own extension to whatever UI. You have to build an entire stack of extensibility in the UI as well.
Right.
I have a number of questions. There's something that we experienced that's, for example, one few plugins that's running and it's scanning, you try and kill it and like find bugs, you kill it, like it's can actually run 2 hours and you cannot kill it. It needs to get a certain point. So what ends up we restarting the set, which is awful. But having this ability immediately abort the job, this kind of not graceful, just kill myself something to have it. It's really nice. Because it's something hanging, and you know the build is bad, you don't want to wait for result. It's useless to wait when the step is complete. Now, the other few thoughts, it's actually, I think we are a few of the people who are running kind of environment that's building a native Linux, Unix. We have not only Java, we have C, C++ code, and it's made us, we're trying to run parallel builds in order to have a build and deliver build faster. And then you have a very complex build, and let's say one of the thread failing because of not source code issue, because of some environment, and you do want to rerun same build. So you don't have the ability, because I'm familiar with other tools that I run before. What I would expect, first of all, when I start the build, I want to see all steps that this build going to proceed, and I can deselect something. So you don't have this. And then if I want to rerun same failed build, I want to say, okay, let's say Windows compilation failed, run me Windows, and then complete. Don't run me from the beginning. This kind of concern. Now, apart from that, what ends up, what we're seeing right now, it's actually we have a lot of jobs actually similar and few parameters different, because you have a parameterized build, and let's say you want to run build on demand, you can change the parameter when you provision. But if you schedule the build, there is no way that you can run, let's say, same job with different parameters. So what ends up, you should, I mean, you need to duplicate all the jobs, and as a result, you have a bunch of, you have a lot of jobs with one parameter different, but this does exactly the same. So to have something sort of environment table that you can plug in associated with a project, not with a job at the front.
That sounds like an RFE for the templates plugin, right?
Okay.
All right.
One comment to one thing that I heard in there. One comment to one thing that I heard in there. I think you mentioned resumable builds that if it fails at a certain step, we would like to resume it, if I understood right. So be careful what you ask for, because some of them go against the tenets of CI. If the step that you failed at was the step that you wanted to get a dependent artifact from somewhere else, if you try to resume it from that 5 minutes later, you may get a different artifact, your builds might not be repeatable. So one thing that we like to advocate is sometimes you can go a little bit overboard in asking for tooling inside the CI tool that actually destroys your whole notion of what a CI should look for. CI build should be identical, and I mean, I should, given the same set of artifacts, you get the same results every time, unless somebody made some changes to it. So just that little comment that sometimes you actually don't want a feature like that, because then you would have builds that would be green inexplicably or red inexplicably, and then you would be wondering what went on.
Yeah, it's true for CI build when it's built it's running half an hour. But if you imagine your build is running 10 hours, the compilation is like 4 hours, and then you have all this tests. So you have a nightly builds, and then one of the step actually failed, and it's, people ask me, where's the build? They say, hey, 9 platform is completed, but, and he's trying to explain what's happening 10th platform. You should have ability to complete, and because the code is good, everything is good, it's just this step failed because some environment, some network issue.
So for builds that run that long, like over 9-10 hours, perhaps a better, I mean, I would be interested to see exactly what is taking that long, but presumably it's a lot of compilation, a lot of tests, the kind of things that make for delayed builds. Parallelization and things of that nature are probably more in order rather than the pause and resume style, because that gets you the slippery slope of your builds are not idempotent anymore.
For C++ code, the like few hour compilation, it's kind of normal for extensive code.
I'll side with you. When we built the Microsoft build, one of the Microsoft build labs, the retry functionality that was in the build system was very heavily used. And these projects would take overnight to build and have 18 different flavors that needed to be built. And people would come in the morning and retry particular steps because the build server ran out of space, or because the network, somebody pulled the cable because they had maintenance on the server. I'd say like half of the builds were using that kind of retry step functionality, and all the children would execute after that as well. So you declare the build in a dependency manner, where you say this step depends on these other steps, and that's how the declaration was working. And that was very successful, so I love the feature that you're asking for.
Yes, there's one question there.
Or just a comment to that, bro. It's one of the things we have a build that can run up to 2 hours, and it's really been it's building appliances, doing BBTs and other things. And it's really, I've subdivided it into 4 jobs. So you do kind of the CI main portion initially. You go do some RPM creation, packaging, and appliance creation. You do some YAML repository stuff, and you do some BBTs. If I need to restart a part of it, I can go to the 4th job, see what the parameters were, and I can manually restart that. So it does give me a little bit of what you're looking for. It's not as automatic, perhaps, as you're saying, but there are some things you can actually refactor a long-running job sometimes into multiple steps actually being different jobs that are part of that chain.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that we've done along those lines is to help improve our ability to restart if necessary, or for us specifically, it's there's a particular test suite that we want to run twice, so we think we've got some flaky tests in there, so we're just going to run it again. Is we create an artifact file with all of the parameters as we go, and then what that does is it decouples having to pass parameters between upstream and downstream jobs, and hope that works. You can just create a file that's a manifest of all your parameters and spit that out everywhere you go. And then if you have to restart the job, you've got that. The job is pre-programmed to use the file for its parameters instead of whatever ran before it. So any individual job can just be redone right from the point that it failed.
So I believe there's a feature in Jenkins that on the parameterized jobs, you can go back to any of the earlier build and then redo the build with the same set of parameters. So it's going back to his point. I think that today the way people make those complex builds triable is by splitting things up into smaller jobs, and then you have the ability to restart from arbitrary place. So that doesn't solve the problem all the time, obviously, but that seems to be how people are doing. Yeah. So just wanted to add that.
So if you're using binary dependencies, so in Artifactory and in the Jenkins plugin, you can actually specify and tell that you want to be dependent on the dependencies that build X created. And you just configure it as your dependency declaration, and you can get dependencies from past builds, and that way you can retry your builds knowing that it's only going to resolve those dependencies. So, another way to resolve it.
Right. So we're sort of coming to the last part of this. So my question is, what is the one plugin that you wished was used more than it actually is? What would you recommend to people?
I know one answer.
That's being committed. Sorry.
In his talk, he was joking around the ANSI color plugin being the best thing in the world.
Okay.
Just saying that. Sorry,
I can answer for that. The ANSI color plugin is highly underused. I think it should be used everywhere where you have ANSI output. So please use it more.
Should I plug ours as well? Yeah. So I think
This is turning into evangelism now.
So probably my favorite plugin that is not one that we have written is the parameterized trigger plugin. I think that should have just come with Jenkins from the beginning. It saves our butts. Honestly, we tried a bunch of different approaches to build a pipeline that fit with what our process looks like, and that was, we tried to join plugin. We jumped hoops trying to get that to work. We even multi-configuration jobs have a couple of limitations that, for concurrency reasons, didn't work for us. But parameterized trigger, once we kind of stumbled upon that, again, it was hard to find it, but once we found it,
okay.
It has solved our problems. So that's my fave for sure.
Actually, today somebody tweeted about the Mimi generator.
Yeah.
That is definitely an underused plugin.
Yeah.
That actually gets to one of my questions. I mean, one of the powers of Jenkins is it's got this plugin architecture, it's open source, but as a relative newcomer to Jenkins, it's also one of the challenges. There's a vast array of plugins, they've got duplicate behavior, they're not particularly well documented. You mentioned stumbling across them. How do you think we might improve the set of plugins so that it was easier to acquire the knowledge to use them?
Right. So some of the progress that's made in that space recently is that we started publishing the installation counts of all these plugins.
Yeah, the usage graph is really helpful because it acts as an activity map as well.
Yeah, and then so that, I mean, we might not have the right view yet, but there's like for each plugin, I mean, the sorted list of what plugins are most popular to least popular. So sometimes that gives you some sense of like where you want to start looking at. I think that has been helpful somewhat. The other thing that I really want to try is like find some graduate student who wants to do some data mining on how plugins are co-installed. So we have data about what installations are installing these sets of plugins. And one would naturally expect that, if somebody is using, let's say, TFS plugin, there's probably a higher chance of the guy using the MS Build plugin than say the Rake plugin or something. So that kind of correlation might when you apply to your own instance, that might help you discover the kind of sets of plugins that's commonly used together. I'm hoping that would be somewhat useful. So those are two things that I'm thinking right now that we hope to do.
Maybe the plugin authors can declare other plugins that could be useful with their own plugins.
That's an interesting idea.
People actually spend time to do that. I mean, it's worth a try, I guess. Yeah. So Debian has this like recommend, I guess. Yeah.
What about just like a simple vote? Plus or minus, whether you like the plugin or not, because not everybody's publishing usage statistics.
Right.
But they may be able to just click a plus, say yes, I like this plugin, or I don't like this plugin, whatever.
Yeah.
The Mimi generator will be on top.
Mandating a certain level of documentation might help as well.
Yeah.
It's not a completely undocumented plugin.
But I guess that we are kind of, I guess just somewhat by the nature of this being open source project, people have like tendency of just writing code and declare victory. And so the part of all this documentation being on Wiki was hoping that the user would chime in and then share their experience about how they use it and so on. That hasn't happened to the extent that we'd like to see, but
but that's not very clear from the wiki. This is actually the first time I'm hearing it.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
I mean, I thought that the whole point of being a wiki is like, it's screaming for you to edit, but okay. So maybe just the fact that you're supposed to update isn't well advertised?
It doesn't seem like that. It just
so this
seems
is like
like
a meta question that to advertise it. How do you advertise it?
Well, perhaps feel free to edit and enter your experience with this plugin and comments on your experiences with the plugin. That should sort of address that, right?
Okay. Yeah, that's a simple thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, if anyone has any other ideas about how we can help to make your plugin more discoverable, I'd happy to hear. It's a challenge.
I think there could also use a bit of documentation. Like, there's a lot of documentation about how to set up for writing plugins. Like, oh, you got to use Maven and you got to set this in your plugin.
Right.
But there's not a lot of docs about using the API. You just got to pour through the Java docs or look at how other plugins are written. So what I was really looking for was like, what are the steps, for a build, what steps go in or for a certain job. I can find it anywhere.
Okay.
So.
Yes, I'll just point out, this is a general problem with open source projects. It's really hard to get people to write documentation. This is a wild generalization. I'm actually thinking of the Selenium project. But just because of my own experiences there, but just generally, writing documentation is not particularly glamorous and it is difficult. So it's one of those things that open source projects tend to generally have trouble with. I know this because this is how I got involved with the Selenium project, is by writing documentation. And it was really interesting because I went in thinking like, wow, this is, like write documentation, this could be boring. And then what I wound up writing was a bunch of Ruby code because there were no Ruby examples. So I actually got to write fairly interesting code. And anyway, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is in terms of maybe not so applicable for the people in this room, but as you come across people who are maybe less technical or less confident in their technical skills and want to contribute to open source, encouraging them to contribute to documentation is a really good idea because it's low barrier to entry. And as much as like we as hackers might sort of think like, wow, I know I'm certainly as guilty of this as anybody. It's like, I want to write code and we want to document stuff. For a lot of people who are maybe not as confident in their ability to write code, it can be really satisfying and rewarding to make a documentation contribution because like we've all been talking about, like we all really appreciate it. So it's maybe for those of us that work with QA people or customer support people who are maybe a little less technical but are still pretty savvy about the domain, it's a great thing to encourage them to get involved with.
Right, this probably is the last question. We've run out of time, but go ahead.
This is just a maybe suggestion is instead of having the mailing list, which although works great, having a forum instead, because although I may subscribe to the mailing list, not everybody wants to. Not everybody wants to know every question. They may just have a simple question, and the only way to get it answered is to subscribe to the mailing list, ask their question, get it answered, and then unsubscribe. That may be a lot of work that I've been involved in other projects where I didn't want to even go through that. I wanted to register on the forum, ask my question, come back when I choose, and get it answered, and not have to worry about subscribing and unsubscribing.
Yeah, I'd love to run something like Stack Overflow. So if you know something like a clone of that in open source side.
There's something called open source question OSQA. It's basically a Stack Overflow clone that's open source.
Oh, cool. All right. Thanks a lot for the panel. Thanks for your comments and thanks for your questions. Thanks.